A year after bitter rivals signed a peace deal on South Sudan, the country remains on the brink. Hundreds have died in fighting in the last 6 weeks alone, and tens of thousands of civilians have been displaced. So, just 5 years after its creation, what does the future hold for South Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. It's been a year since a peace deal was signed on South Sudan. Then, many had hoped the agreement would bring peace to the world's youngest nation. But fighting resumed in July, just as the country was marking its 5th anniversary. South Sudan has now been in conflict for much of its existence. Thousands of people have been killed, millions more have been displaced from their homes. The UN says almost 1 million South Sudanese have now fled to neighbouring countries since the start of this latest unrest. Inside the country, peacekeepers are sheltering more than 170,000 civilians at 6 different sites. And the humanitarian crisis is continuing to get worse. Well, we've been speaking to Festus Mogae. He's a former president of Botswana and a mediator in the South Sudan conflict. And he says despite the fighting, things are back on track, at least in Juba.
Well, as you are aware, the implementation of the peace agreement was interrupted by the fighting. Now the fighting has ceased, and there have been developments, positive developments, in the sense that a new vice president has been appointed, and after various consultations, it has been decided that we resume the implementation of the peace agreement in full, and that is why we are here.
Civil war broke out in South Sudan not long after it declared independence from Sudan 5 years ago. But things seem to be turning around last August when President Salva Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar announced they were ending their 2-year civil war and renewing a power-sharing arrangement. Machar returned to Juba in April and was sworn in as first vice president. But fighting resumed 2 months later after clashes between rival militias. It happened just as South Sudan was marking its 5-year anniversary. And more than 275 people have been killed since July. All right, let's bring in our guests. In London, we have Heller Perache, who's head of programs for Doctors Without Borders. In Norman, Oklahoma, via Skype, we have Casie Copeland, South Sudan analyst at the International Crisis Group. Also in London, we have Ochieno, contributor for the New African magazine. Welcome to you all. But can I start with you, Casie? This is a conflict between two bitter rivals. It's been characterised as two power-hungry men who've basically held their country to ransom. Now with Riek Machar seemingly out of the picture, do you think that makes the peace deal more easily implemented?
I think what it means is that a different version of the peace deal is going to be implemented. The government signed 1 year ago under some quite extreme pressure. President Kiir made clear he had a number of reservations to the agreement on its signing. And now what we see is a year afterwards, they've effectively turned the tables. And now they're going to implement an agreement partially, very much to their favor, and without, for the time being at least, without Riek Machar.
And Joseph, can I put the same question to you? Do you think the absence of Riek Machar will make it a lot easier for South Sudan to regain some semblance of calm?
Unfortunately, no, Martine, as you've just been said. I think in the interim, yes, because Riek Machar is a big player in these. Perhaps Riek Machar's forces, they may be small in South Sudan, but perhaps they might actually be the much more organized of the two forces.
It has to be remembered, doesn't it, that this might be characterized as a bitter feud between two ambitious men, but the results, the ensuing results on the people of South Sudan are just too terrible to even contemplate, aren't they? Give us an idea of how many people, particularly outside of Juba, are living today.
Well, it's exactly as you said. I mean, the worry is that it's the civilian population who bears the brunt of this conflict. Currently, right now, there's around 200,000 people still living in protected sites, protected by UN peacekeeping forces. Beyond that, there's hundreds of thousands of people who are living away from their homes. Many people who are living in areas, in swamp areas, where are the only places that they feel safe. There's some 70,000 people who have fled the country towards Uganda for refuge. Sickness is rife in many areas with much displacement. Disease affects people in ways much more directly when living in swamps, when living in the bush. People are exposed to the elements. Waterborne disease affects many children. Malaria has been rampant throughout the country. The population has really been devastated by this conflict, and it's years that it's going on now.
And Casie, when we talk about this peace agreement that we hope is now going to be implemented, what exactly do we mean? Because the backdrop, as we've just heard from Andre, is absolutely terrible for the South Sudanese people.
Exactly. It's one of the reasons I think there's been so much effort put into trying to secure an agreement. It's a view that if the conflict continues, the levels of human suffering will only continue to increase. What we have is a difficult situation because while the war was often said to be between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, each pressuring for the presidency, that covers up some other quite important facts, which is that the opposition mobilized following atrocities that were committed in Juba in December 2013 by government forces against the Nuer ethnic community. This group was then led by Riek Machar, but they weren't fighting for him. They were really fighting for some much more communal reasons and fighting, in essence, to protect what they believed was their community from these threats. So without Riek Machar, what we have are these forces are still there. They've not committed their loyalty to the first vice president. And so we have an agreement which lacks what we would call the warring part of the warring party of the opposition forces. So we're going to see a lot of efforts on from the government to try and sort of negotiate with them. And they will negotiate within the parameters of the agreement, and they will also offer side deals to try and bring different groups in and to sort of break the opposition's unity, bring them in smaller groups, which are less threatening. So this is sort of the gamble that's on now to see if this model can bring some greater stability than what we've seen over the last year. And it's an open question.
Joseph, earlier you said that Riek Machar remains a big player in this South Sudan equation. What is happening to the men who followed him, the fighters who've been following him? We know that he's in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, at the moment. He's been out of the country for at least 6 weeks, I think it is. But what is happening to his forces? Are they not pledging support to the new vice president?
Absolutely not, and that's exactly what I said. And as I said, the risk is here that 12 months later, we are basically just fighting another process called peace. You know, this, Martine, has moved now beyond Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. In fact, there is an element of what I would call the third force, as already been suggested. Many of the people in Juba and many of the elites outside the control, if like the influence of these two, are beginning to say, what exactly are they fighting for? And why is the focus on the two nationalities, two communities, the Nuer and the Dinka? In fact, the people of Equatoria who see themselves as, if you like, much more robust when it comes to exposure, academia and everything else, are saying that what is in this for them? That is why many of them were beginning to say that perhaps we needed to have an element of an intervention, not necessarily an occupation, but an intervention to create an enabling environment in which all Sudanese, South Sudanese, are able to partake to the national cake, minus or with or without these two parties. But I must say this also, it's perhaps slightly unfair that as we are talking today, we haven't yet really understood why the spark to that created this recent conflict in itself after independence.
Are you talking about December the 13th?
Indeed, because that
2013.
Yes, indeed, Martine, that has not been resolved. That has not been resolved. And I think we hoped that when these two men came back and sat together, many of these other things would be resolved as a matter of national reconciliation and truth-telling rather than fudging it. At the moment, with Riek Machar out of the table, that has been fudged. And what are we doing? As I said much earlier, the forces outside government may be fewer, but they're much more organized, much more training. Remember, SPLA is one of the biggest known military names on the African continent. But if you go into detail, they're probably one of the biggest grouping of militias you can think of anywhere on the African continent. It's a risk. And who are the people suffering? The vast majority of South Sudanese people. This is a country in crisis, and I think the sooner and the better this thing is resolved, the better really for most of the people in that country.
Absolutely. All right, Andre, I mean, I don't want us to lose track of the conditions on the ground for the people, the vast majority of people in South Sudan. And I know that as Doctors Without Borders, you're not going to engage in political questions, but currently being discussed is the possibility of a 4,000 strong UN force to augment the existing UN mission that's in South Sudan. Do you think that an improved security environment, first of all, do you think that would improve the security environment, and is that what the civilians, the people of South Sudan, need in the first instance?
I would say that an improved security environment is certainly what the people of South Sudan need. Now, regarding the effectiveness of the additional regional peacekeeping force that will be coming in, it's difficult for me to speculate. What I can say is that the peacekeeping force that was in place, the UNMISS mission, they were unable to keep up with the protection needs. That's needs for people to be protected from physical violence throughout the country, even in the protection of civilian sites, which are these essentially UN bases that protect the population. One of those was burnt to the ground in February, that's Malakal. Another was attacked massively inside of Juba. Now, today, there is fighting in areas where there was not a heavy presence in the past, primarily throughout the southern belt of the country. People need safety, but it's more than that. When you're working as an aid actor and you're trying to reach populations who are in desperate need of medical help, it's not only a question of having permission from warring parties or from authorities to be able to set up an aid operation, let's say in a village or in a city someplace, but the population, if they're trapped on the other side of the front line, they need to be able to pass through those front lines to access the emergency health services that they need to stay alive. And this is what we're asking of all parties right now, is to allow for free access of the population to medical services or to other humanitarian services throughout the country, and in hopes that the situation will get better. And
Casie, staying with that theme of the violence that's been wreaked upon the people of South Sudan, sexual violence has become almost embedded in this conflict, hasn't it? And justice is therefore a very, very important part of the new peace agreement. How far, if at all, has the AU got with establishing some kind of hybrid court, which is part of the agreement, in order to establish some accountability for the atrocities that have been committed in South Sudan?
Very little progress. It's created some internal structures that can move through the AU's bureaucracy to begin to negotiate with the government of South Sudan. Initial negotiations were supposed to have taken place many, many months ago. We should have already seen progress on this, but there are a host of reasons, including the delayed formation of the transitional government, which mean that we've seen really no progress at all. But I'd like to highlight that in addition to a hybrid court, the peace agreement also calls for processes of truth and reconciliation, and perhaps even most importantly, for compensation. And for many of the victims of war who've lost everything, this can be perhaps an even more immediate and meaningful form of justice than what will be trials that will take place far away and many years in the future. So we have a much broader set of justice tools at our disposal, some of which can be much more beneficial to the victims themselves in the short term.
And Joseph, the peace agreement, we have to, I suppose, keep referring to that because that's all we've got to go on, will now involve a new Vice President, first Vice President Taban If he doesn't command the support and the loyalty of the SPLM-IO, the forces who back Riek Machar, what's the point? I mean, can he really be a viable player for this next stage of South Sudan's history?
That's why I suggest that this is probably a fight process. I was quite surprised actually in the last week or so to sense that the international community, if I put it this way, are basically saying yes to him diplomatically simply because they want to see a semblance of continuity. Maybe it's going to take time for us to actually see how and which way it goes. But as I said before, the underlying issues to me are most important. And as has already been suggested, the biggest challenge facing this country at the moment is basic security. And if the UN, and international agency organizations in that country cannot have the security guaranteed, if even guys in government cannot have their security guaranteed, you can imagine most of the vast majority of the ordinary people. But really back to this, I think that what is likely to happen is that maybe with the arrival of the regional forces, there may be a semblance of wait and see from both sides. Now, if Salva Kiir and, in this case, the new vice president present themselves as guys who are willing to listen and to be much more accommodative, it is possible that we will see a process in which more South Sudanese people begin to look at the way forward in the absence of the three players, if you want to call it, at the moment. For the moment, I think it is still very, very difficult and too early to say.
And Casie, so we've got to deal with Taban Deng and Salva Kiir. It has been suggested that both of these men have to make a grand gesture, a gesture of reconciliation. What could those gestures be?
I think we're seeing a lot of work going on right now. It's very interesting. I think both the president and first vice president are aware that the majority of the opposition fighters are not with them. So they're engaging in conversations, they're making offers, even concessions on things that are important to some of these opposition groups and then some of the reasons they're fighting. And those conversations are sort of that we would call negotiations over integrating these groups back into Juba under some sort of big tent. So this has been tried in the past. It's sometimes been successful, sometimes it hasn't been, but it's a model that most people are quite familiar with in South Sudan, and I think it's the path that we're going to go down now.
And Andre, I'm particularly interested in the ethnic divide that has really surfaced in South Sudan as a consequence of conflict. And we often refer to the Nuer of Riek Machar and the Dinka of Salva Kiir. But what sort of pattern are you seeing with regard to communities and the ethnic groups when it comes to fleeing violence? Are you seeing one particular group being targeted more than others?
Well, what we see at this point is really a widespread amount of fighting throughout the country. As doctors and as humanitarians, we don't see one ethnicity or another ethnicity. We see patients, we see beneficiaries and people who need us. What I can say is that there's no major region within the country that's been spared some of the conflict and turmoil. And the results of that are that the civilians of whatever group within the country have really bared the brunt of this conflict. South Sudan is a very diverse country. It's much more than the two ethnic groups that you mentioned who live there. There's a huge number of different peoples who live in this space throughout the country, in the West, in the South, as well as in the North itself. But to us, we see patients. We see people who are suffering, people who are forced to live off the most basic means of life support possible, just fighting to stay alive.
And Casie, but this is an issue that is going to have to be taken into account, isn't it? Because no matter what, the fighting has brought out certain fault lines, should we say, that may have existed in the country beforehand. Perhaps they didn't, but they've certainly emerged now as a consequence of the fighting. How can those rifts, those ethnic and tribal rifts, be bridged?
There are a lot of political reasons for fighting, but when I go out and I speak to some of the combatants themselves, many of them will give ethnic reasons for the fighting. And in many ways, some of it is very positive in the sense that they want to protect their community. There's a lot of pride in that. It's also very negative because what it means is that we see these awful atrocities committed against other groups in the name of this. So we really need some kind of political settlement which is seen as fair I think, first and foremost, that create some of the stability for these dialogues to go on between communities. Because if we don't have stability and we see that communities are still fighting, then we're not going to be able to pull back from this. And every year it goes on, it's getting deeper and worse. So we need a macro political settlement to then enable these communal conversations to take place, and they really must for South Sudan to move forward.
And Joseph, is that macro political settlement any more likely? We've already identified that Riek Machar is not completely out of the equation, even if he's out of the country. We saw John Kerry just this week in the region promising more assistance to South Sudan, but telling the main players to get on with it and get the job done.
At the recent UN session, the US seemed to be coming out as probably the more sensible player in this, including suggesting that an arms embargo should be actively considered. But I must say that back slightly to a point you made earlier about with Andre about the nationality composition called tribal, is that might suggest that many people who are fleeing out of South Sudan, unfortunately, coincidentally, ironically, seem to be the Dinka, while at the same time it's reported that many South Sudanese are not allowed to leave by air, except if they are Dinka. And yet by road, it has been reported, particularly going towards Uganda, that in many cases, local communities have targeted the Dinka and pulled them out of vehicles, and in many cases killed them. So to me, I think this is something which is substantially worrying. That is why it's extremely important that going forward, a political settlement that really embodies broader South Sudan with the three key players together is important. There is no way in which I think at this stage we are going to have a settlement in South Sudan without the influence of Riek Machar.
Okay, and Casie, so a lot then is going to rest upon this proposed force of 4,000 coming from various African countries, although Uganda and Ethiopia have quite recently opted out of that. So much needs to be accomplished by these in order to at least establish some semblance of security before anything else can happen.
That's actually not the case, and this is what's really the most interesting thing about this force. Juba is under control of the government and has been now for 5 weeks or 6 weeks since the fighting stopped. The opposition forces are nowhere near Juba, nowhere near threatening the government, yet the regional force is mandated to deploy into Juba and to be based in Juba. So to some extent, there's the idea that they're providing security for a place that's not likely to see another round of conflict because the opposition forces have been pushed very far outside of the capital. Yet in the places where we are going to see more conflict, where we can say it is almost guaranteed, that's not where the regional force is set to be deployed. So in many ways, this force was it almost looks like it was designed for the situation we had 2 months ago, where we had two warring parties' forces in the capital city, and the UN might need to interpose themselves between them. Yet that's not the case anymore. So I think there are a lot of questions about what the real objectives of this force are.
And Andre, I think the last word to you then, just to remind us of the dire situation that people are facing. What do the people of South Sudan need, and need now, in order to improve their lives?
What they need is strong political will at the highest levels of the international governmental system. They need full support of the international community in terms of providing a lifeline through this dark time. The future is highly unclear and the situation is extremely dire. In the month of June, we treated 10,000 malaria cases. In the month of July, that number was 15,000. We do 60,000 consultations every month for medical patients throughout the country. People are barely getting by right now in South Sudan, and this situation needs to get substantially better for things to start to rebound after this. What's required is full commitment towards the humanitarian effort that must continue unhindered by all parties to the conflict in order for the civilian population to not bear even more the brunt of this.
Okay, can I thank all of you for a very interesting but sadly rather gloomy conversation. Andre Heller Perache, Casie Copeland and Joseph Ochieno, thank you all very much. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. More discussion, should you want it. You can go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. There's also a conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story, from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha. It's bye for now.